He told me I couldn't speak at my own mother's funeral. Not a word. Not even goodbye, Ty. So I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I waited until he finished his cold, polished speech, until the silence in the room grew heavy. And then I stood, just a small recorder in my pocket, with her voice on it. The voice he could never silence. Welcome back to Betrayal HQ, the channel where quiet revenge hits harder than loud rage, where we tell true feeling stories about family, betrayal, and the moments that change everything. If you've ever been silenced by someone who thought they owned your story, this one's for you. Let me take you back to the week my mother died, and the day I let her song do the talking. Before the silence, there was routine. I lived in a house where mornings smelled like burnt toast and strong black coffee. My mother always woke up first, humming while she made eggs, her slippers brushing softly across the linoleum. My father, he'd read the paper in silence, nod once if the coffee was right, shake his head if it wasn't. We weren't loud, we weren't close, we were functional. While my brothers threw footballs in the backyard, I'd sit on the steps, sketching the cracked bark of the maple tree. My father never said much about it, just muttered once, "Art doesn't put food on the table." So I learned early. Don't expect applause, don't expect to be heard. But my mother, she saw things others didn't. She'd leave small notes in my lunch bag. "I liked your drawing last night." Or softly whisper, "Sing that song for me again. The one you made up." I didn't have much, but I had that Ty. Quiet mornings, her gentle eye, a routine that wasn't joyful, but familiar. Before the funeral, before the shut doors and denied speeches, I was the quiet son in a home that only celebrated noise. And she was the only one who ever asked me to speak. My mother moved through life like a quiet wind, never demanding attention but always noticed when gone. And while most people saw a housewife in soft sweaters and gentle steps, I saw a woman who carried the weight of everyone else's silence. I remember how she'd tap her fingernails on the table when nervous, how she'd hum when she needed to think, and how she always made time for me. Even when time was tight, she was warmth in a house that measured love and expectations. My father, on the other hand, was the kind of man whose voice carried across walls and didn't welcome response. His suits were always pressed, his words always few, and when he spoke to me, it was with the flat certainty of someone who had already decided who I was. Soft, small, and not worth the breath. I recall one Thanksgiving when I sang a song I had written for Mom, and as everyone clapped politely, he leaned over and whispered, "This isn't about you," as if joy needed permission in his house. Then there were my older brothers, loud, sure of themselves, carbon copies of him with rough hands and eyes that never quite looked at me the same. After I turned down football for piano, one of them once called me Mom's pet project, after she praised a painting I did of her garden. And though he said it with a laugh, it stuck like a nail behind my ribs. Even my cousins close in age, raised down the block, used to say things like, "You're not like the rest of them," and I never knew if they meant it as a compliment or a warning. The church family respected Dad. Of course they always did. He was a pillar, a leader, the man with a firm handshake and a strong opinion on everything that didn't concern the heart. And when Mom passed, it was them who offered him comfort, while I stood quietly beside her casket, gripping the edge like a child again, wondering if anyone else remembered the lullaby she used to sing when I had nightmares. Or if they just remembered her casseroles and kindness. Even at work I learned to shrink, colleagues who shook my hand without making eye contact, supervisors who asked me to speak up more in meetings, friends who became distant when I declined the after-hours bar scene. Not because I didn't want to belong, but because I'd spent so long learning how to survive in silence. I forgot what it meant to take up space until that moment, with the recorder in my pocket, and her voice trembling through the walls of that funeral hall. I finally understood. I wasn't invisible. I was just always standing next to people who never learned how to see. What mattered most to me wasn't recognition or revenge. It was being seen by, truly seen in a way that didn't require permission or performance. Because my mother wasn't just my parent. She was my witness, the only one who ever looked past the quiet to find the meaning behind it. When I played piano as a boy, it wasn't the applause I craved. It was her glance from the doorway, the nod, the knowing smile. When I showed her my sketches, she never asked why I drew in shadows. She just said, "You see the world clearly." And in a house where a man's name echoed louder than his love, she gave me space to be soft, to be still, to be honest. I didn't want my father's respect, because I knew it came with strings and silence. And I didn't chase my brother's approval, because I'd spent my entire life being the one they didn't get. What I wanted, what I needed, was that unspoken thread between us. Me and her, built over decades of glances, late-night lullabies, and quiet dinners, where she'd pass me an extra roll without saying a word. And I'd know she was telling me, "I see you." So when she died, I didn't lose a roll. I lost the only voice that ever said I mattered without needing to explain why. And that recorder in my pocket wasn't about revenge. It was the only way I had left to let her speak, and to remind myself I was once loved exactly as I was. It started with silence, longer than usual, heavier and not the kind we were used to in our family, but the kind that tiptoed through rooms and made you question if you'd done something wrong. The first time I noticed it was 3 days after she passed, when I offered to help plan the service, and my father didn't even look up from his chair, just muttered, "It's hand," like I'd interrupted something sacred. The phone stopped ringing for me, though I knew they were calling. My brothers, my uncles, just not me, because apparently when decisions are made in a house like ours, softness is not invited. I went by the church to drop off a photo she loved, a candid of her in the garden smiling at a tomato plant, and saw the program proof sitting on the office desk with no mention of me listed under family reflections. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a simple omission. But when I asked my father directly, he just stared at me with that hard, unreadable face and said, "This isn't about you." And that phrase, those 5 words, carried more weight than any scream. I noticed how my key didn't quite fit the front door of his house anymore. How the family WhatsApp thread went silent after I sent a voice note about a song she used to sing. How one cousin replied with just a heart emoji. And then nothing else. How I showed up to the florist with ideas and was told it had already been ordered. And not by me, it was 100 little things. A seating chart that placed me 3 rows back. A casual offhand comment from my brother that they needed the service to feel clean and simple. And the way Dad closed the conversation the moment I mentioned playing a small piece of music she'd always loved. No one said it out loud, but I could feel it. The slow erasure, the tightening circle, the subtle message, "You don't belong," and how she'll be remembered. And it wasn't rage I felt or even sadness. It was that old familiar ache of being in a room that looked like home, but feeling like furniture. The memories don't come in order, they arrive like waves. Unexpected, overlap, triggered by things like the smell of her perfume still lingering on the inside of her coat, or the sight of her handwriting on a grocery list, pinned to the fridge. And when they hit, they don't ask for permission. I remember one rainy afternoon when I was 12, stuck inside while the others wrestled and yelled, and she sat with me on the kitchen floor teaching me how to fold dumplings, saying not every kind of strength looks the same. I remember the night I didn't make the team and cried quietly in my room, thinking I'd failed her somehow, and she came in with warm socks and said, "I never asked you to be like them. I just asked you to be here." I remember how she always had time for my music, even when the oven timer was going off and the phone was ringing, and how she'd stop mid-task to say, "Play that again. I want to feel it one more time." I remember one Christmas when Dad got called away on work, and she and I sat by the tree listening to vinyls. No words, just breathing in the peace of each other's company. And how she whispered, "Sometimes quiet people carry the loudest hearts." I remember her humming while sweeping, tapping her foot to some tune in her head, and how when the world felt too big I'd sit outside her door just to hear that soft rhythm. And I remember most of all, the way she looked at me during small moments, when I handed her a glass of water, when I tuned the guitar, when I simply existed, and how those glances said more than any applause ever could. So when I look around now and feel the frost setting in, the meetings I'm not invited to, the decisions made without me, the way they all avoid my eyes, I hold tighter to those moments, not to mourn what I've lost, but to protect what they'll never understand. Because they can take the microphone, the program is the seat at the front, but they can't take the way she made me feel like I was enough, just by being hers. It happened the morning before the funeral, under a clear sky so painfully perfect, it almost mocked the ache I carried. When I showed up at the chapel early, holding a framed photo I'd chosen carefully, one of her in the garden, sleeves rolled up, laughing at something I'd said behind the camera, and as I reached for the side door where I'd always entered for family events, the usher gently stepped in front of me, eyes apologetic but firm, and said, "I was told to let in immediate family only," not realizing that in that moment, he'd cracked something that had already been bending for years. I stood there stunned, half smiling as if maybe I'd misheard, and even when I said I'm her son, it came out like a question, not because I doubted it, but because I could already feel that in their version of this day, my title had been revoked. Eventually someone recognized me and waved me in through the side, past the guestbook table where my name had somehow been misspelled, and into a sea of familiar faces that suddenly felt far away. I walked to the front to place the photo near her casket, but the spot was already filled with a glossy image of her and my father from their anniversary trip, smiling in forced harmony, posed and curated like the entire event. When I asked my brother quietly if I could switch it, just for a moment, he said, "Let's keep things simple today." And there it was, my first real lesson in how betrayal doesn't always come with slammed doors or screaming matches. Sometimes it arrives as a smile at a funeral, a pat on the back, A polished speech and a subtle but unmistakable reminder that I had been edited out of the story. And no one was going to stop the erasure. I sat in my car outside the chapel, engine, but the key still in the ignition, watching the stained glass windows flicker in the late afternoon sun, wondering how the hell we got here, how a life built in songs and garden walks and hand-packed lunches had turned into this curated silence, this scripted grief that didn't have room for me anymore. I didn't cry, I hadn't cried yet. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain felt too old, too familiar, like reopening a wound I'd learned to live with. I remember gripping the steering wheel just to feel something solid, anything to remind me that I still had a place in this world, even if they wouldn't name it. And for a moment, I'll be honest, I almost didn't go back inside. I almost let the silence they handed me swallow me whole, because what do you do when even death doesn't earn you a seat at the table? When your grief is treated like an inconvenience. I looked down at the recorder in my passenger seat, her voice inside it, waiting, fragile, trembling, real, and I closed my eyes, took one breath and realized I didn't need them to listen to me. I just needed to let her be her. There's something cruel about being erased by the very people whose weight you carry, especially when the world only ever saw them standing tall, but never noticed who held them up from underneath. I remember when Dad nearly lost the business, and it was me of all his sons who dipped into my savings to cover payroll. No thanks asked, no credit given, just a quiet transfer, and a nod over morning coffee that meant more than any apology that never came. And then there was my brother, same one who told me not to make this funeral about me, who once showed up on my doorstep 3 years ago, drunk and terrified he'd ruined his marriage after a one-night mistake. And I, the soft one, the quiet one, sat with him all night, kept his secret, even lied for him when his wife called, because loyalty to me wasn't something I performed. It was something I carried, and my mother knew that. She saw it in the ways I bent without breaking, forgave without asking for anything back, stayed even when no one remembered to say thank you. And maybe that's why this hurt so much. Not because I expected a reward, but because I thought somewhere in all that sacrifice, I'd earned the right to grieve her out loud. I was already on edge, holding myself together with threadbare dignity, trying to give them grace they never gave me. But what broke me, what truly cracked something I'd been holding shut since the hospice room, was when I saw the printed funeral program laid neatly on every chair in the chapel, the one with her smiling picture on the cover, the one with the eulogies listed by name, and mine wasn't there, not omitted, not forgotten, replaced. Instead, under family reflections, I read my father's name twice, once as husband, once as speaker, and my oldest brother, who hadn't visited her once in the hospital, is listed as voice of the family. I stood there in that aisle with the paper shaking in my hand, heart pounding in my ears, and I knew it wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate, edited, sealed. They had rewritten her goodbye without me, and as if to drive the knife deeper, my cousin, well-meaning, clueless, walked by and said, "It's beautiful, right? So tasteful." She would have been proud, and all I could do was nod, because if I spoke I would have shattered. I walked out to the car, clenched the steering wheel with white knuckles, and stared at the recorder in my pocket, like it was a lit match in a room full of lies. Because in that moment I wasn't just grieving my mother. I was grieving every time I'd swallowed my voice so they could stay comfortable. And now it was time, not for revenge, not for but for the truth, her truth, to echo through the very space they tried to silence it in. I didn't yell, didn't storm out, didn't flip chairs or demand answers. Instead, I sat in the back of that chapel, the program folded tight in my palm like a secret, my breathing slow and measured while the weight of everything pressed down on me. And all I thought was, no more begging for a place at a table I helped build. I didn't confront my father. I studied his face, unmoved and composed like always. The man who taught me that control was power. And in that moment I realized I had learned more from him than he ever intended. Because now I knew how to stay still, how to move without noise, how to plan without permission. So I went home that night and sat at her old desk, the one everyone forgot she used to write thank you cards, and I opened her address book, still marked with her neat blue ink. I pulled up files on my laptop, receipts, statements, recordings she'd left saved under generic names, things I never thought would matter, and yet here they were, evidence of love, of memory, of music. And then I opened the folder with the audio, her voice singing quietly into a recorder like she knew, deep down, I'd need this one day. And as I sat there, bathed in the quiet hum of the desk lamp, I didn't plot revenge. I preserved legacy, not out of but because sometimes the most powerful response isn't shouting or swinging. It's standing in silence, holding the truth in your hands and waiting until the moment they can no longer ignore it. No announcement was made, no fists were raised, no declarations spoken into family group chats. Just quiet steps, subtle shifts, and silence where they expected struggle. While they gathered for photo ops and sympathy calls, I was at her bank,
sitting across from the branch manager with paperwork she had quietly signed years ago, making transfers they never thought to check. I stopped contributing to the family fund that kept Dad's second mortgage afloat. Just let it go cold, and when the accountant called, I said politely, "Redirect everything tied to her name to my address." And she said, "You're listed as primary, did they not know?" And I said nothing. I visited the funeral home alone, not to change their plans, but to add one detail to the audio setup. Just a small, unlisted file queued to play last, embedded under closing song. No one noticed. No one questioned. Because quiet people don't raise alarms, they hold keys. Keys to recordings, to email backups, to voice memos saved under dates. Only I remembered. I called the old neighbor across the street, the one who used to garden with her on Tuesday, and asked if she still had that voicemail. Mom's voice singing happy birthday in that soft way she had. And she did, and I saved it. Each move was deliberate, each step legal, invisible, irreversible. And through it all, no one asked where I was, because they didn't see me as a threat. They saw me the way they always had. Quiet, harmless, unnecessary, and that's exactly why it worked. There was a moment 2 nights before the funeral, when I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, her voice playing soft from the recorder, and I found myself asking the question I had been avoiding for weeks. Was this the right thing to do? Maybe I should have walked away. Maybe I should have let them have it all. The stories, the speeches, the closure. Maybe silence would have hurt less than holding on to this ghost of justice. Because the truth is, I wasn't sleeping much. I was replaying old conversations, wondering if I had imagined the love, if I'd made her into more than she was, if maybe I was clinging to a version of her no one else remembered. And I kept thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if this quiet resistance just makes me look bitter, small, desperate for a spotlight in a story that's already over? I stared at the ceiling and thought about my father, how calm he always looked, how he moved through every room like he owned it, like grief should come in suits and schedules. And then I thought about her barefoot in the garden, singing to the tomatoes, laughing with her hands in the soil, telling me once, "Let the world be loud, but don't let it turn you down." And suddenly I wasn't sure if this plan was about me being heard anymore. Maybe it was about her never being forgotten. Even if they never saw me, maybe they'd hear her, and maybe that would be enough. The mistake came wrapped in confidence, like it always does, the kind that only happens when someone believes they've already won. It was the night before the funeral, during the private dinner my father hosted for close family. The one I wasn't invited to but heard about through a cousin's tagged photo on social media. There they were, laughing around a candlelit table, wine glasses raised, my oldest brother giving a toast with his hand resting on my father's shoulder. And beneath the caption someone had written, "A perfect send-off, handled with strength and class." No mention of her name, no mention of mine, just a celebration of how they pulled it all together. As if grief was something to coordinate, not carry. But it wasn't the photo that cut me, it was the voice message that followed, accidentally forwarded to me from a group text I had long been removed from. It was my father's voice, low and pleased, saying, "It's better this way." He always made things about himself. "This service will feel clean without his interruptions." And that was it. Not an explosion, not a revelation, just quiet confirmation that I was never meant to be part of the goodbye. They'd rewritten her ending without the one person she used to sing to when the rest of the house slept. And in that moment I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity, because they'd shown their hand too soon. And tomorrow I would show them what silence could really do. It happened just as I knew it would. Quietly, without warning, without a raised voice or a slammed door. Just like storms that don't howl, but soak everything before anyone realizes they've been drenched. The chapel was full, every seat taken, and my father sat in the front row like a man who had already claimed victory. Chin up, suit pressed. The program folded neatly in his lap, the same program that still bore no trace of my name. The service flowed as they planned. Verses read, flowers praised, and speeches offered, in that same curated tone that made grief feel like a corporate seminar. Clean, rehearsed, and then came the final moment. Closing song. The cue printed near the bottom in small font, unassuming, almost forgettable. And that's when I rose. I didn't speak, didn't glance at my father, didn't ask permission. I walked slowly to the front, the same second row I'd been relegated to, giving way under my quiet steps, and placed the recorder on the podium. Not a flash drive, not a CD, just a simple black handheld device she once used to leave me notes when her hands hurt too much to write. I pressed play and waited. Her voice filled the chapel, trembling, soft, worn from age and time, but unmistakably hers. She sang the lullaby she used to hum when I couldn't sleep. She sang it not like a performance, but like a memory trying to stay alive. And the room fell still. No shuffling, no coughing, no breath, just her. No one had expected it. Not the guests, not the cousin, not even my father, whose face went blank. Not angry, Not shocked. Just suddenly small. He didn't move. He didn't interrupt. Because in that moment, even he knew. This was the truth. And I didn't need to raise my voice to deliver it. When the song ended, there was no applause, no outburst, no correction, just a long stretching silence that wrapped around every corner of that chapel like smoke. Thick, inescapable, sacred. I didn't look at them. Not at my father. Not at my brother. Not at the rows of people who once called me sensitive. Like it was an insult. I just stood still, gave her voice the space it never had, while she was alive, and let it echo. A few guests wiped their eyes quietly, without theatrics. One woman near the aisle clutched her chest like something had been pulled loose. Inside her, and my cousin, the same one who'd posted the dinner photo, looked down at her lap and didn't raise her head for the rest of the service. My father didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence said everything, the stillness in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the seat as if bracing for a wave he never saw coming. And that was the moment I realized. I had said everything I needed to say without uttering a single word. After the service, people parted around me like I was carrying something fragile. Grief or justice, or maybe both. A few nodded. One man, much older, stopped and said quietly, "I didn't know she's. Thank you for letting us hear her." And that was it. No victory parade. No grand vindication. Just a shifting in the room, like the ground had moved and only a few had noticed. My father walked out last. No handshake. No eye contact. Just that hollow stillness, of a man who lost something he thought he'd locked away forever. But I didn't need an apology. The song had done its job. They couldn't unhear her. And I didn't need to be seen anymore, because finally she had been heard. I'm not the man I was when this began. Back then I was still waiting. Waiting to be invited, to be recognized. To be given a voice in a family that only respected the loudest one in the room. But something shifted in that chapel. Not when I pressed play, but when I didn't reach for the mic. When I let go of the need to explain myself. To defend my place at her side. To prove that I belonged. I used to think silence was a kind of surrender. Now I know, it can also be a sword. They didn't see me at the front of the room. They saw her, heard her, felt her, and for once that was enough. I walk differently now. I don't beg to be included. I don't sit quietly hoping someone else will remember the truth. I carry it with me in her handwriting. In that song, in the memory of that afternoon sunlight pouring through stained glass. While her voice filled the air. Am I healed? Not completely, but I'm no longer hungry for their approval. And that's something. Some days I still hear her singing. Not out loud, but in the quiet moments when I'm folding laundry, or standing in line, or driving with the windows down.
And I smile. Because I didn't storm the podium. I didn't yell. I didn't fight for the mic. I just let her sing. And in the end, that was louder than anything they could have said. So if you've ever been silenced by pride, by power, by people who never saw your worth, let this story be your proof. You don't have to scream to be heard. You just have to stop shrinking and press play. It was just a recorder, old, scuffed, the kind you'd find at the bottom of a forgotten drawer. Batteries taped in place, screen cracked from years of use. But to me it was sacred. It had lived in her hands more than mine, tucked in coat pockets and glove compartments, used to capture grocery lists, recipes she never wrote down, and the soft humming of a melody she swore she'd one day finish. When her hands started to ache, she stopped writing and began recording little messages instead. Reminders for me, birthday notes, songs, prayers whispered into plastic. I didn't think much of it then. It was just her way. But after she passed, I found it in the bottom of a blue shoebox, wrapped in a tissue, as if she knew it would matter someday more than anything else she left behind. And in that box, buried under old thank you cards and faded photos, I played the last recording, her voice raspy but full of life, singing the lullaby from my childhood. And that was when I knew. This wasn't just a voice note, it was her last gift, her final word, her refusal to be silenced. That recorder went everywhere with me. In the days that followed, into the chapel, into my coat pocket, into the moment they thought they'd erased me. It sat in my hand while they spoke over her memory, while they listed names and titles and roles that didn't include mine. And when the time came, I didn't write a speech. I just held that recorder up like a torch, pressed and let her carry the room. And now it sits on my desk, right beside the framed photo of her planting tomatoes. And on quiet nights when the world goes dim, and I start to wonder if it was all worth it, I reach for it, feel the weight in my hand, and press play. Not for them, not even for her, but for the part of me that finally learned how to speak without asking. I thought that was the end. Her voice filled the chapel. They listened. They sat in the silence they built for themselves. And I walked away. Not triumphant, but full. I didn't need more. No confrontation. No apology, just the memory of her voice echoing in the one room they tried to keep me out of. That was enough, or at least I thought it was until a few days later, when a letter showed up in my mailbox. No return address, just my name written in the same neat cursive she used to write on envelopes. Inside, one sentence: if they ever silence you, play this too. And a second record, still sealed, still full. I haven't pressed play. Not yet, but it sits on my nightstand, waiting. Because maybe she knew they weren't done trying to erase me. And maybe she wasn't done speaking either. Was I wrong to protect what was mine? To guard the last piece of her that hadn't been polished, cropped, or spoken over? Was I selfish for refusing to sit quietly in the back while they rewrote her memory, without the only person who knew her in stillness, in struggle, in truth? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a single door. I didn't rewrite history. I just kept one part of her safe. And when the time came, I let her speak. Was that revenge? Or was it remembrance? You tell me. Because maybe love isn't loud. Maybe justice doesn't always wear a gavel. Maybe the most honest thing I ever did was not say a word. But you, what would you have done if the only person who ever saw you clearly was buried beneath a story you weren't allowed to finish? They thought I'd beg for the mic. They thought I'd argue, break down, maybe walk away defeated. But I did. I just waited until they built the stage, invited the crowd, and handed me the silence. Then I gave it back with her voice. And in the end, they never even saw it coming. You didn't hear it from them. There were no witnesses offering second angle, no cutaways to their faces, no flashbacks told by anyone else, just me, just what I saw, what I carried, what I kept quiet for too long. I didn't tell their story. I told mine. I didn't guess what they felt. I told you what I lived. Because when they handed me silence, they never thought I'd know what to do with it. But I did. I turned it into something louder than they could ever control. A song, a truth. And I never asked anyone to believe me. I just let you sit beside me and feel it. I didn't touch the recorder again for 5 months. Not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready to feel her voice echo through me a second time. Grief doesn't move in straight lines. It waits. It lingers in doorways, in birthdays, in soft songs that play by accident in the grocery store. 5 months later, I finally opened the box. The same one I found tucked beneath her bed, with the second recorder still sealed, the notes still folded. I still haven't pressed play. And 2 years before all of this, long before she fell sick, before the coldness sharpened in the house, I remember walking into the living room and hearing her record herself practicing that same lullaby. I thought nothing of it. I thought she was just trying to remember the tune. But now I wonder, did she know? Did she sense the silence coming? Did she see how they'd try to bury more than her body? Maybe that's why she sang it twice. Once for comfort, once for proof. Would you have stood up? Or would you have let them finish the story without you? Would you have pressed play, or stayed in your seat, second row, like they planned for you? Tell me, what would you have done if the only person who saw you was gone? If the voice that once called you enough was suddenly edited out of the room? What if you had one last chance to let them hear her? Not for applause, not for closure, but for truth. Would you have spoken, or would you have let the silence do what it always does, and erase you? If you've ever been pushed to the edge of your own story, not by accident, but by design, then you already know, this wasn't about revenge. This was about being remembered, the right way.